All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another episode of the podcast. This week, we're going back to the college football well, mainly because I find as we're finalizing the playoff and the conference champions are being determined this coming weekend, a lot of college football is different now with the playoff with 12 teams and the realigned conferences, NIL, transfer portal. And this past weekend, we had one of the vestiges of the old guard, if you will, of college football, which is a good old fashioned rivalry game, right? Not just any rivalry game, the rivalry game, which is Ohio State and Michigan, which anybody who's in the Midwest is going to tell you is called the game, right? It's the one that fans of both of these universities circle on their calendar every single year. You know, there's a reason why it's the last regular season game played for both the Buckeyes and the Wolverines, because it generally just means more. And I want to talk today about the rivalry, that specific one, rivalries in college football in general, and where we're headed with the way the playoff is. So let's start off with the actual rivalry itself. So I lived in the Metro Detroit area for almost 20 years, right? And so I knew a lot of Michigan fans. I also knew some Ohio State fans, and the hatred is real, right? This isn't a fabrication or a forced hatred or anything like that. It's a very real thing. And the Michigan fans will call Ohio State the Suckeyes. Ohio State fans generally refuse to even acknowledge the name of Michigan. They just call them the team up north. And, that's just kind of the way it goes. If you're a Michigan fan, you go down to Columbus, you're always afraid to be attacked. Likewise, if you're a Buckeye fan coming up to Ann Arbor, there is a hostility there. And historically, it's because they're very close regionally, and Ohio as a whole, and Michigan to a lesser extent, is a hotbed of recruiting talent in football. I think your main states in the past have been Florida, Texas, California, but also Pennsylvania and Ohio. And Michigan and Ohio State always fought over those Ohio recruits. It was a hotbed of talent, and they'll always be going after the same guys. And because of that, that's kind of where the rivalry. And you had iconic coaches, of course, Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler, and both have produced a number of pro prospects. I think lately Ohio State has been a little bit more dominant in that particular aspect, but that's starting to change now as over the past couple of years, Michigan has really bumped up the recruiting, in the Jim Harbaugh era, now in the Sharon Moore era. So that's kind of the scope of this rivalry, right? There's hatred, and again, you have a lot of people in both of those states that have moved to the other state for work or family purposes. So you'll see a lot of people who are from Ohio who live in Michigan, and a lot of people from Michigan who are living in Ohio. So it's just this melting pot of fandom, and they feel incredibly passionate about it. And you add into that is how bad both cities' pro teams have been historically. The Lions, one of the worst teams in the league. Again, historically, right now they're doing amazing, probably the best team in the NFL. But they had playoff droughts for the longest times, and the Browns, after the Jim Brown era, always kind of were stumbling. They had the relocation where they didn't have a team for a year with the whole Ravens thing, and so that's kind of like it became a thing where you rooted more for your college team because at least they were winning, right? As opposed to the sorry display that your pro team was offering. So it kind of became almost like a reprieve from the misery of what you would see on Sundays, is that at least you would see a high level operation on Saturdays, right? So that kind of created the fandom even more. And especially for Ohio State, think about there's a lot of schools in Ohio, but there aren't a lot of big name schools in terms of football. Like the closest one is probably Cincinnati. But all the other ones are, MAC schools, and like, Kent State or Bowling Green or the University of Ohio itself. So Ohio State's kind of like your big name one. Whereas like in Michigan, you have Michigan and Michigan State. In Alabama, you have Auburn and the Crimson Tide. So, there's a lot of, big time focus, or Ohio, pretty big state with a lot of people. They're all locking in on that one team, right? Unless they happen to be Cincinnati fans or something. So that's kind of the other thing. And the last part of it is that this game usually means has a lot at stake, right? A place in the Big Ten championship or outright winning of the conference, positioning for the national title race, and all that. So the stakes are always high. I remember when I first moved to Michigan, it was in the fall of 2005, and that was the year where both Michigan and Ohio State were undefeated going into that game, and I think they're ranked 1 and 2 in the country at the time. Those when Troy Smith was there, Chad Henne was at Michigan, and the game mattered, right? Because it was a de facto elimination game from the playoff. This year, the stakes, I think, weren't really that big. Granted, Ohio State was in a position to get in the Big Ten championship game, but regardless if they won or lost, they were going to be in the playoff, right? They had won enough games. They had a couple of good wins. Their only loss was a close loss to Oregon, so they were basically in one way or the other. Michigan, they weren't really playing for anything, right? They were just it was a down year after the national championship. They had 6-7 wins, going to go to some bowl game, and that's that. But of course, they're always going to get up for their rival, and they're always going to do that. So for Michigan, the incentive was to get in the mix of disrupting the Big Ten title game, right? So instead of getting an Oregon-Ohio State rematch, they would allow Penn State to get in there and spoil one of Ohio State's goals. You talk to Ohio State fans, they have 3 goals. 1, beat Michigan. 2, win the Big Ten. 3, compete for a national championship. That is the goal for their team every single year. So Michigan, by winning this game, effectively made sure that 2 of their 3 goals were not realized, which is the Big Ten championship and the losing to Michigan aspect. And so for Ohio State, they obviously want to win the game, but there's also pressure on them in this game because, they had it won in 3 times and it became a 4th because they ended up losing that game. And as a result, we've had a lot of Ohio State fans just kind of say, we got to fire Ryan Day. You can't beat Michigan. You got to be out. And I just find that to be incredibly unique because I don't think it exists with other rivalries. Like out here in Washington, we had the Apple Cup earlier this year. Washington lost that game. I don't think Jedd Fisch is under any scrutiny because he lost that game, right? Or you got the Egg Bowl that just happened, Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Mississippi State, of course, bad team this year. I don't think that Lane Kiffin would have caught fire for losing that game as much as he would have caught fire for how that loss would deteriorate the playoff chances. Miami and Florida State, same thing. I just don't think that losing the one game is more indicative of losing your job as it is to losing playoff positioning, right? And I think the only rivalries that are on the level of Michigan, Ohio State in terms of relevance and mattering is Army-Navy, which is kind of its own spectacle for a different reason. And I don't think there's anyone else. You could say Georgia, Florida, because they play the game in Jacksonville, neutral site. I don't think, I feel like the OSU thing, you circle it on the calendar, you want to watch that game, more like you do with Army and Navy. If you miss South Carolina, Clemson, if you miss Cal, Stanford, or Notre Dame, USC, or, any of these traditional rivalries, I feel like they've kind of been watered down. And yet this is the only one that's still there. And I think the reason is because both teams are still nationally relevant. And you could say, well, Georgia and Florida are nationally relevant. Florida hasn't really been in the national title mix or conversation for a number of years, right? Whereas Georgia's just been on a rampaging run here. And I just think that what has contributed to this, and somehow they've remained insulated, is that with the playoff, the rivalries have kind of been less important, right? I think the main thing is for a lot of these teams, I just got to get into the playoff. Because even with Michigan, quote unquote, wrecking Ohio State's year, they're still going to be in the playoff. They're still going to have a chance to win a national championship, even if they don't win their conference. And for many Ohio State fans, that's going to be the only way that Ryan Day saves his job. And which is kind of interesting because he's been overall incredibly successful as a Buckeye coach, but when you lose to Michigan and you don't really have any national titles to show for it, the fan base is going to start to turn on you because even if the landscape of college football has changed, the way that fans and communities view success is still very much rooted into the old way of things, right? And I just wonder, is this a good thing or a bad thing for the overall state of college football? Because for many, the whole pageantry of a rivalry is what makes the sport, right? It's what makes it exciting, it's what interests people and that sort of thing. But now it feels like the only objective is to make the playoff. And I think about a team like Alabama. If you had said to them, hey, look, you're going to lose 3 games, but make the playoff, or you're going to only lose 2 games, and one of the games is to Auburn, but miss the playoff, I feel like they would be more mad about missing the playoff than losing to Auburn, right? Like, that's just kind of the reality. And I think that ultimately for the students they matter, especially if you're like in the same state and some of your family went to one school, another one went to another. But I just don't find it as much of this like national wide ranging headline as it used to be. And in a way, that's the beauty of Ohio State, Michigan, is that it still really matters. Even with Michigan with a down year, the game mattered. It was big noon kickoff. It was the most important game for many people on the Saturday slate, which is kind of saying something because there's a lot of big time matchups. Again, we mentioned Clemson, South Carolina. Before that, they had a big game, a big matchup, and they were both ranked, and kind of South Carolina ended up taking over there. But I think it's just because everybody's just so focused on the playoff. And like South Carolina, for them, the bigger thing was, yeah, we beat Clemson, sure. But the bigger thing is like, hey, this is really good for our resume if we happen to sneak into the playoff. Because ultimately, if you want more NIL money, you want transfers to be interested in you, you have to win in the playoff. And you have to show that you're a national title contender to get that recruit to flip from LSU to come over to your school, right? And I think that missing the playoff for multiple years, that's going to be the cause of a lot of these teams to fire their coaches. But I do think that for Michigan, Ohio State, the game still matters. The rivalry still matters because they are still competing for the same recruits. That hasn't changed. And a lot of times they hire these guys who have an affiliation with the program. Like Ryan Day had worked under Urban Meyer, so he's kind of part of the community now. Jim Harbaugh went to school at Michigan and came back to bring it to glory. Sherrod Moore is his assistant. In many ways, the way that Sherrod Moore and Ryan Day got their jobs is very analogous, right? Because they were assistants under an iconic coach who won a national title at that school. So kind of filling in those shoes is always difficult. But I kind of think it is almost like a time capsule because in this age of transfer portal, NIL, conference realignment, media deals, and everything has kind of become corporatized in college football. And it's always been that way in the NFL, so I think you don't really mind it in the NFL. But in college football, there was always like the pageantry and tradition. And I think that you lose that at the Power 4 level a lot of times. And this is the one exception to it. And I think that's why it still captivates people. And ultimately, I think it's a message about the state of college football today. Have we gone a little too far in stripping away tradition in the goal of finding common ground for more profitability? I talked to a friend of mine and she lives in Ohio. She's been an OSU fan forever. And she was kind of telling me how her and her son feel a real connection to that Buckeyes team. And I talked to friends of mine in Michigan who are Wolverine fans and Lion fans. They love the Lions, and they're incredibly happy about the success they're having this year, but it doesn't match the unbridled passion they had when Michigan was doing well last year. when they were on their way to winning a national championship. And I think you connect with the coaches, you connect with the community, the college towns, you connect with these players that you watch develop. And we've lost that in a lot of other schools. Like Alabama and Georgia, it's all about winning the playoff, man. It's all about finding the best player who's going to be in the NFL, and it's about winning the playoff. And it used to be about beating the rival, in addition to that other stuff. And it's not really the case anymore. And it's a little sad, right? Because that was part of the mystique of college football. And I think for that reason is why so many people still clamor on to Michigan, Ohio State, to Army, Navy, to their regional matchups even. Like, I'm sure, like, in Starkville with when the Egg Bowl's going on, Mississippi State people were locked in, because they wanted to show that, hey, we can beat Ole Miss and all that. So I think it's still there a little bit, but it's just been overshadowed so much by the corporatization of college football. Even something like the Red River rivalry between Texas and Oklahoma. That feels corporatized, and like you start to wonder, do these players really care? Are they super like into it like that? And I think Ohio State and Michigan players are. You saw the fight break out at the end of the game because of the flag planting. Side note, I'm pretty sure after this stuff, we're going to see flag planting be banned in this coming off season. But you like that, right? You like the passion, you like the pageantry, you like all of that stuff because it shows a human element, an emotional element that maybe you don't really get in the pros. And I think college is increasingly becoming like the pros, which is both good and bad. It's nice that players are paid, but you don't have that school pride anymore as much. So it's just something that I personally struggle with a lot. And I'm glad that we have an Army Navy. I'm glad that we have a Michigan Ohio State. I wish it was more of it. And maybe I think you probably have it at the FCS level. I think Grambling and Southern is still a very good rivalry, for example. And you do have a few of those on the smaller scale. But I just wish, that more people paid attention to when Georgia plays Georgia Tech, for example, or when Miami and Florida State meet, in those type of games. And, I would like to see more of that, but I also understand this is the reality of college football. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Would love to hear your thoughts on college football rivalries. Are they dead? Am I overreacting, or are they kind of an endangered species? You can always check out the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. A rating, review, and subscription would be awesome. If not, thank you for listening. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. See you next week on another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast.